All right. Chris Pearsall, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, great. I'm going to call us to order at 6:01. And Chris is going to be our minute taker. At this time, is there any public comment? If you want to raise your virtual hand or wave in front of the screen. Okay, not seeing any hands. All right, we'll move right into board management and governance. And we have our meeting tonight with Nate Levinson, and he's here in attendance. So Patrick, you want to do you have a brief introduction?
Yeah, I can just do a brief introduction. So welcome, Nate. So Nate Levinson's here. Most of us recognize Nate from his work with the district management group. They've been very active in Vermont. They've written some reports as commissioned by the Vermont legislature. So Nate has a great understanding of the Vermont context. Nate's also kind of branching out on his own a little bit more now. He might be able to talk some more about that. But really appreciate the expertise that Nate brings in terms of developing systems for helping struggling students. I think that's certainly been a lot of the work that we've been engaged in, supported by some of Nate's research and writing. I know our admin team just finished a book study of one of Nate's recent books. The entire board has a copy of that book to just kind of help understand some of the systems we're trying to build as we work to support student needs, despite the fact that we have declining enrollment and financial challenges. But Nate has lots of experience also working with school districts around the country that are struggling with this declining enrollment issue and all of the challenges that come along with that. So that's more specifically tonight what I think we're hoping to tap into in terms of Nate's experience and expertise. So welcome, Nate. Thanks for being here, and we appreciate the support you're bringing.
Great, my pleasure. Everybody able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Love it when the technology works. Very excited to be with you. As Patrick shared, I think I bring two things to this conversation. Hopefully in about 2 hours, from now, you will think it was a worthwhile conversation. Is one, yes, I have spent a lot of time in Vermont working with, well, far more than half the districts in the state. And so I do get, and that's been for about a decade now. And yes, I've done a lot of work around how do you support struggling students, but about the other half of my life has been around how do you deal with declining enrollment. And what they both have in common is these are just two of the bigger challenges that school systems face that don't have easy answers. And as a result, I've spent a lot of time doing research in these areas, and I think more importantly, on the front lines, helping districts deal with these challenges. I do want to set expectations low. There is no silver bullet. There is no simple, easy way to deal with declining enrollment. But there are a lot of lessons that people have learned. You know, I know you have been at this for some time, as has the whole state, but there are lessons that other districts that have navigated these waters, and some of those lessons are, hey, these are things that have really made a world of difference, gotten you to a much better outcome in a way in which most of the community supported. And there are also lessons in the category of, whoa, please don't do this, because everybody who does, and it might sound like a good idea at the time, it usually blows up, and blows up meaning you don't get to a good place and a lot of people feel hurt along the way, which just seems an incredible waste because nothing came from it. So I've been in your shoes. I actually spent 6 years on a school board dealing with some of these issues. I've been a superintendent. I have definitely dealt with these issues then. And I have led, as I said, quite a few districts through similar processes, some successful and some not at all. So I will confess some of the lessons learned, I've learned the hard way. But at least you can be the beneficiary of that experience. What I was hoping to do tonight is one, to make this very interactive, because this 2 hours on Zoom is not fun unless we really make sure it's interactive. So I am hoping we've got good participation. I will create a number of opportunities for you and to be both open-minded and critical friends, that if there are paths or thoughts that you've got, I definitely want to listen. I want to highlight, when they're aligned to some of the best practices, and point out maybe ways of tweaking them if they are often, as I see, well thought out, but given all the complexities of declining enrollment, sometimes not as successful as you would hope. So that's our goal. I think ultimately, at the end of the couple hours, I'm hoping you've got a few more strategies, perhaps enough information to rethink or to craft a plan forward. But again, I want to be very conscious of the fact that this is not your first day dealing with this, and much is underway. So with that, I'm going to share the screen just to give you a little more detail on the agenda, and then there's an icebreaker that I'm really looking forward to hearing from the board members first and foremost. So let me share just for a few minutes. Folks able to see my screen? Get a thumbs up, perfect. So best practices for addressing declining enrollment. Oh, I should have mentioned, and this is an odd thing to say, and I don't tell this to everybody in Vermont, but my start in public education, so I spent the first half of my life in the private sector, but loved public education. That is the most important thing in the world. And I got involved in local schools as basically a school board member's worst nightmare. I was that angry parent who came to board meetings, hate to say it, who screamed a whole lot, thought everything the board was doing was crazy, ultimately became a school board member, realized I didn't understand half of what was going on. I probably didn't understand 10% of what was going on. But I do come to this from an interesting perspective that, as a parent, I was not very supportive of the school board. As a school board member, I thought I was, far more informed. And then I became a superintendent and realized that even as a school board member, I was not very thoughtful and not very helpful. So I've definitely seen this from many angles. And obviously I've worked with over 250 districts and probably 30 plus districts specifically and exclusively around declining enrollment. And along the way, I tend to write a lot as well. So 5 parts to tonight's session, an icebreaker. Want to talk a little bit about why it's so darn hard to deal with the declining enrollment. Share some lessons learned. I also want to put some alternatives that may or may not be relevant, but what are some steps you can take that are less drastic, but get you part of the way? And then to leave at least a few minutes for people to reflect on what might come next. So that's our plan for the day, for the night. And you just want to recognize that you are in the midst of the perfect storm. If we didn't have declining enrollment, there are still so many challenges. And mind you, I was saying this before there was a pandemic. Before we had the pandemic, here's what's true. What we're expecting schools to do is increasing. There was one time in which, reading, writing, and arithmetic seemed like important things. But then we said, it's really critical thinking. It's 21st century skills. It's the skills you need to be successful after graduation. And then we realized along the way that, hey, to do all of that, we've got to meet the social and emotional needs of kids. We need to pick up the role of counselor. We need to pick up the role of mentor. We need to build relationships with kids. And then somewhere along the lines, we realized, hey, to do all that, we're going to have to address behavioral challenges as well. And then we learned along the lines that, some of the skills we want to build around technology and STEM and the arts are getting more and more complex. It seems that every couple of years, we have added a fairly substantial new expectation on the schools. And I will tell you that I think everyone there is reasonable. But along the way, we have not been adding funding at the same rate that we have been adding expectations. And then another thing that's happening at the same time is the kids who walk into your school buildings every morning, at least back when they walked in every morning, they walk in with a lot more needs. They are needier. And like, while all of this is happening, you all are seeing enrollment decline. And when enrollment declines, so does funding. And so to have these greater needs, fewer resources, declining enrollment, now let's throw a pandemic. This has not been a great year for a lot of kids. Not a great year for a lot of teachers either. But the needs just keep going up. And one of the things that I think is really important, and why I think this discussion is so important, is something that's fairly unique to Vermont, is that your districts are very small. And even, post Act 46, you went from tiny to just small. I mean, there really isn't even, maybe there are 2 mid-sized districts in the entire state. Mind you, I have worked in places where people routinely refer to a district of 20,000 students as small. So you as a district are facing all of these growing challenges with smaller central offices, fewer people who are experts. It just seems like as all of this is coming together, the pressures are great. I hope you appreciate what Patrick and his team does, because there's so much to be done. And compared to almost any other state, fewer folks to do it. And what happens is, if you don't address the declining enrollment, you end up spreading, the work on fewer and fewer people. It just seems to get harder and harder. So this was important before the pandemic. There's nothing in the future that says it's going to turn a corner. And so having a thoughtful plan to address declining enrollment so that the district's in a very strong position to meet all those very significant needs. So, and then, to know that you're not alone, not just in Vermont, but in a lot of states. We are seeing small districts get smaller and big districts get bigger. That is the nature of America today. So here's the first thing I want to do, because I really want to hear from you all. And I'm going to try to, and so for each of the board members, and Patrick, if you could help orchestrate calling on folks, just really in 3 sentences or less. So this is not a book, this is not a novel, not a short story, but really in 3 sentences or less. And I know this is even not a given, but there's been discussion of, should you repurpose a few elementary schools? And maybe the answer to this question is we shouldn't, but I'd just love to hear each of you where you are at this moment. If somebody asked you, hey, why should the district repurpose a few schools? In 3 sentences or less, what do you tell folks if asked that question?
Okay, I'll work left to right, top to bottom. Don, you're on my top left.
Oh, I was hoping I was on the bottom. Oh, okay. Why do we repurpose schools? How do we give kids, our kids, that same exposure to all opportunities if we have to keep stripping away pieces of a school, one piece at a time? How do we, does that make sense?
Yep, it does.
Sandy Lee?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. The question is, why should we repurpose schools?
If somebody asked you that, what would you answer? Yeah.
I'm going to give a typical answer. I guess the question would be, what do you mean by repurpose? Because for me to answer that question, I guess I need to know what that means.
Yeah. Fair.
Sarah LaPearl.
To be able to increase opportunities and in general, I don't know. I think that's the big thing, would be increasing opportunities and creating better outcomes without spreading stuff so thin that you can't see any growth.
Great, thanks.
Dave Sharp.
Hi, thank you. So I think we need to repurpose every school in our district. I am so impressed with your work, Nate, and this book that the superintendent shared with us, actually bought for all of the board members.
Thanks, Dave.
Hi. All of our schools need to change how they operate in order to close the gap, especially with pre-K situation, what it is, worsening the gap between the kids of means and poor kids.
Rob Backlund.
Love the hot seat icebreaker, Nate.
Hey, this is a hot topic. There are no softballs in dealing with declining enrollment. So let's just start with that.
Yeah, so I agree with Sandy. I think it would, how you define repurposing. I think we should repurpose schools so that they become community schools, so that no matter who you are in a town, from the age 0 to your deathbed, you can go to that school and it will provide you with some form of service. So if we're going to repurpose schools, I am a strong proponent of creating community schools. And that's how I would describe repurposing schools.
Great.
Kevin Hansen.
Well, I guess I'm thinking within the context of the current superintendent's proposal. I think it's important to keep in mind that we need to set aside the adult vision of what we want each little school to be in each little town and whatnot, and utilize the schools in such a way that it makes it workable to have the right staff level for the right opportunities for the student body, and not to not disaggregate in the sense that you're spreading things too thin. The repurposing would obviously mean some schools will be used differently than others.
Great, thanks.
Krista Siringo.
Hi, Nate. Thanks for being here. I guess I would say that if we needed to repurpose schools, I would want us to do that because we felt that was the best way to ensure that all of the kids going through our schools were getting what they needed, and that we couldn't provide those services and opportunities without finding a way to think differently about our buildings and our schools. And I'm also deeply interested in and concerned about different abilities of communities, and within those economic abilities for community members to fill in gaps that the school might not be able to provide. So I don't want to rely on that. I want our schools to be able to provide for everybody.
Got it.
Andrew Morton.
Hi, so I guess my answer to that question for community members was that we pull everyone we have into a more centralized location so that greater efficiency leads to better outcomes and equity. And that equity meaning that everyone has equal access to all necessary social, emotional, and academic supports, as you're suggesting, Nate, that things are only getting, kids need more and more. So that we're not in a place where we have a bunch of half-time counselors or coaches who are only here half-day Mondays, Thursdays, and every other Friday, depending on the school.
Christina Blanchett.
Hi, Nate, thanks for coming. So I have the unique position that I've worked for social service agencies and schools for 18 years. And so 3 days a week now I'm in schools, like living that. what you were talking about. So my my thing is, whatever we need to do, whether it's repurposing, whatever it is, to help every kid reach their potential, to offer the most resources possible for kids below proficient, for kids above proficient, to lift everybody up, and to keep up with the world. I have a daughter who's a sophomore in college, and she went out and saw what other kids have available to them, other schools in the United States. And she was blown away and sad that she didn't have a lot of those opportunities and resources here. And so I have 2 kids still in the high school. And so, but I want every single kid to be lifted up, whatever it takes. And I don't know what it's going to take, but your book was awesome. And I didn't read it all, but we just need to what's that saying? Every blade of grass has an angel standing over it saying, grow, grow. That's what we need to do. So that's where I'm at. And thanks for being here tonight. This is going to be great. Thank you.
Liz Sayre.
Hi. So I think bringing like services together is kind of the concept that works best for me, because it could happen in a lot of different ways. But it's about bringing the like services together so that we can have as much flexibility as possible to meet the needs as they arise and be able to address things in the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Steve Rooney.
So these are some side points, not necessarily main points. I think people have covered the main points pretty well, but in terms of repurposing a school versus closing it, I think gives us more flexibility should circumstances change. Those schools are still available. And the idea of repurposing a school to provide maybe a more focus on a non-traditional educational approach, I think is an intriguing topic if it's done well, and could become an example or a lantern for the district rather than a detriment.
Great.
All right, Nate, I think that's all the board members present right now.
All right, well, thanks everybody for sharing. It really helped me get a sense of where folks are at. And there's 2 things I want to point out as I was listening, taking notes. One is how many of you referenced doing better for kids, doing more for kids, whether it was equity, services, the experiences they're going to have, closing the gaps. And that was really heartening. Having led 50 plus of these kind of conversations, sometimes they focus almost exclusively on dollars and cents. Save 2.2 FTE, reduce cost by 2.4%. This was really a very encouraging that many of you who wanted to do something or thought something needed to be done, grounded it almost exclusively in, we want to do more and better for our kids. I want you to kind of post it and put it on your monitor and never forget that, because one of the things that I have noticed, and having seen some of your prior school board presentations or what's been written about it, it is surprising how often that what started as this very thoughtful, this is about kids first, second, and last, often degenerates into $10,420 saved here, 1.1% saved there, and very often the very purpose for why you're doing it gets lost in the messaging. And it shouldn't, because I will tell you that one best practice is no one will ever support really tough decisions. And there's a range of tough decisions if it is just to balance the budget. Only superintendents lose sleep over it, and some school board members. But you are a very small group of people who will suffer through uncomfortable decisions around money. So I really appreciate that so many of you are starting from it's about kids. But there's a challenge to keep that at the forefront through every conversation, every presentation, and every decision. That's one thing I heard. Another thing I heard, which I totally empathize with, is, yeah, if there aren't better alternatives, like, but what else can we do? What else have we thought about? Are there other ways to get to good outcomes? And ultimately, and we'll talk a little more detail in a moment about this issue of what are the alternatives. Because, you know, if I asked, you know, if somebody said, do you want, you know, burnt steak for dinner tonight? My answer is definitely not. Because I'm thinking in my head, I'll call in for pizza and have a pizza and a salad, and that'd be like way better than, you know, burnt steak for dinner. And I use that example because I did in fact burn the steak on the grill last night. But here's the issue. We're talking about declining enrollment. The question isn't, what do I want for dinner? It is, we got some steak, it's burnt. We're either eating it or we're not having dinner tonight. And all of a sudden that steak didn't look nearly as bad because the alternative was wait until breakfast. And I think, and it's not the best of analogies, but it happened to come up last night, is that everything we want to be talking about and researching and communicating with the public and with stakeholders isn't, do we do this or not? Because like the or not isn't a choice. You don't have the choice of not addressing declining enrollment. I mean, yeah, we got lucky, if we can use that term. You know, federal dollars will probably buy you breathing room for a year or two. But at some point, the declining enrollment forces you to make cuts. And you don't have the choice of, no, we'll just keep doing everything the same. And so I really appreciated folks who raised the question of like, hey, what else could we do? What else have we thought about? And I will tell you that one of the best practices, the lessons learned, is people who have successfully addressed declining enrollment didn't necessarily have more success because their plan was a better plan. They had more success because they had a better process for generating alternatives, for helping people understand the pros and cons of those alternatives, and quite honestly, getting people, and maybe even some of you, to say, whoa, this alternative that I really, really like so much better than Patrick's plan isn't actually a viable alternative. If I had $1 for every alternative that would not work, I would not be with you tonight. I would be on my own island somewhere. And conversely, I've been in places where the kind of crowdsourced alternatives turn out to be way better than what anybody else came up with. But addressing the fact that one, the conversation has to be, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. Because the choice, because so many people, particularly stakeholders who aren't as close to it as you all are, what they really want is to maintain what you have without cutting staff, without reducing services, without having 9 more people spread between 2 buildings. And that just is not a realistic option. And then the other piece, as I said, people will have ideas in their heads, maybe only loosely developed, that sound so much better than anything you will come up with. And part of the reason they sound better is they haven't been worked through, they haven't been costed, and the less detail there is, the better they sound. So I just wanted to say that like that first opening conversation was encouraging on both fronts, because I think you've hit upon 2 of the most important things. I want to share a little bit of some of the background that I think can help inform this conversation of what we have learned and what the research has said. So like, why is it so hard to deal with the declining enrollment? And I think if you understand the causes of makes it hard, and I know some of you have been just living it, but it actually helps you plan strategy differently if you really understand the root causes you need to address. So I'm going to share again for a few minutes. So why is it so darn hard? I think we need to, like, for proof of how hard it is, and this is not to be discouraging because I'm basically optimistic that there is a good path forward, but most districts cannot actually address declining enrollment until there is a crisis. And you may think there's a crisis because like there's impending doom. No, a crisis means after you laid off 15% of your staff, or after you have cut out art and music every other day. It is really disappointing. And you know, as somebody who advises districts, this is one of the saddest things I see, is that if you don't have a really good process, even if you had a good plan, but you didn't have a good process, no matter how severe your impending challenges are, it's not sufficient until you've actually had to do a number of things you never wanted to do. That's like the fallback. That is what actually happens. Like you cut things that you said you would never be a school board member and cut, or a superintendent you cannot believe you are recommending, because the process to get to a different, better outcome wasn't sufficient. So the first thing I want to just put in your mind, and this is a mistake that I have made more than once, where I will look at a district's finances. I will see that, whoa, these guys are stretched so thin. And I look at the projections for enrollment, and I look at what the state funding is going to be. And you say, oh my God, this is a disaster that is just a year or two away from calamity. Obviously, that is going to motivate people into action. And I'm just telling you that it's no matter how bad things get in advance, in that prediction of disaster, it has never been sufficient to get a community to accept and embrace hard decisions. But a good process can get you there before you make decisions that you hated making. So why is it so hard? A lot of it is because, and this is, I just really want to stress this, it's people's feelings. So if you are spending most of your time running Excel models, you are spending too much time on Excel. And mind you, I'm an engineer by training. I was a practicing engineer, and yes, as a consultant, I do a lot of Excel. But here's what we hear when we interview folks. It's like people are deep down, and they may not even want to tell you this, but they are hurt that people don't want to live in your communities, at least people with young children. They've moved away. That's why you have declining enrollment. So just acknowledge that this whole conversation starts from a fact that it's like, it stinks that we need to do this, and it's perhaps a little even insulting that, you know, if people just stayed here, and this is, all of you have stayed, I know you think it's a great place to live, but this is a very emotional topic just because it's an indication that people are moving away. A few of you have already mentioned this loss to our community. Again, you don't measure loss to a community in FTE, dollars, or an Excel spreadsheet. But I believe that the number one reason districts are unable to address declining enrollment in a proactive way is that there isn't enough time and thought into how to minimize the loss to the community. And again, this goes to how people feel, not to a ledger. It can really be an end to people's history. You know, if a school is repurposed, and even simple things like the name goes away, that can be, for folks who have been in town a long time, or even not that long, that is a huge issue. And then I think the last piece, and there's no insult intended to any of you, Patrick, you in particular, but there's always an issue of trust. And I don't know why that is. And I don't mean why particularly around, you know, your superintendent or your central office team, but maybe when confronted with a situation that would rather not be confronted with, you know, the facts that are not pleasant, there will be a fair number of people who don't believe your facts, who don't believe the problem is as bad as you think. who believe that there are alternatives you have overlooked for reasons they don't understand. And so this issue of belief is important. Now, if we take a pause and look at this list of 4, and these are not the only reasons it's hard, but these tend to be the 4 I see at the top of the list. They are all around thinking about the heart. It's not the head. And what we want to see, and again, what I have learned in 20 years of doing this, is that a good plan forward and a good process has to be, yes, 50% of it should be, this is technically what we'll do, this is what we'll save, this is what we'll allow it to do. But at the same time, fully 50% of it has to be addressing and acknowledging how difficult and sad some of these decisions are. And I'm going to confess, one of the first times I helped a district through this, I very much underestimated. You know, it was easy to say, hey, I can come up with a technical solution to your problem. But that technical solution did not address the loss of identity, the loss to the community, didn't address nearly well enough the fact that every plan we put forward, people weren't necessarily trusting the data behind it. So, I mean, how many thousands of spreadsheets can you run? And none of them are going to convince people if they don't really believe some of the numbers or assumptions that are driving it. So, first big takeaway is your plans forward, 50% addressing the heart, 50% addressing the head. For the head, that tends to be technical, but for the heart, that tends to be process. So we're going to talk a bit more about how important the process is to getting people comfortable to finally make a decision and to make a decision that they can support. With that, quick question. Do we have the chat function, Patrick? I did not see it on my screen.
We don't have the chat function. That's been, from a legal perspective, we've been encouraged not to use the chat function since it's an open meeting.
Okay, fair enough. I figured that might be it. So not in the chat function. I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe we won't have every single person, but at least 5 folks. I'd love to hear from you all, like what have been the top 2 obstacles to successfully addressing declining enrollment? Because I know you've been at it for a while. I'm here tonight, I presume, because the path forward is not simple, clean, and easy. So I'd just like to get a sense, and then maybe I can share some reactions to how others have addressed some of these obstacles. But so what's made this hard? What are the obstacles? Patrick, do you want to call in folks? I'm happy to moderate you.
Sure, I'm happy to call in folks. I saw Dave's hand.
Thank you, Patrick. So I would say for myself, the 2 biggest obstacles are the fear or sense of loss of community that one of the board members mentioned in their initial comments. And the other is that the solutions that I've heard or proposals that I've heard, while they may talk about equity, what they're really talking equal rather than so. I don't think equal access actually provides equity, and that's what I'm concerned about for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else, a couple challenges that you're seeing.
Kevin?
Well, I'll echo Dave's community. You know, the whole aspect of education rapidly goes to the wayside when somebody talks about their school not remaining exactly the same in some of these towns. And the other one that I've observed is there's not a belief that we are in a situation that enrollment's declining or will continue to decline, that people will flock into the district and fill the gap.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Others?
Han?
So I think one thing that kind of came to my mind was about the balancing the students' needs, but the other piece that I think is an obstacle is the state funding method. I think it causes problems, just the nature of it.
Just a little more, Don, to elaborate.
So we might have student needs that go up, but we have this ceiling that we're capped on. So if our student needs go up, then we have to make adjustments in another part of our structure that might take away something else we're trying to work on.
Yep. Got it. Yep.
Andrew?
So I like how you framed it, Nate. So I'm a therapist in my day job, and I've been thinking a lot about.
But so am I.
Yeah?
No, this.
Yes, for sure. And I've been thinking a lot about like the stages of grief and sort of how a lot of the public response has been similar to that, and that, you know, the first stage of grief is often a place of denial. So we've heard a lot of denial that this is actually a problem, or a lot of minimization, that the problem is overstated. And then I think after that, there's a lot of anger towards folks on the board, towards the superintendent, towards the plan, because they don't want to hear something that we're all having to address and confront. And if you've been on the board for a while and watching the enrollment, we've been seeing it. And then after that is a lot of pleading, bargaining. Maybe we should address the issue with rises in healthcare spending. We should address the issue with the legislature. All of which I think are relevant and important points, but things that are often far beyond the purview of the board itself. And then I think what I'm starting to see is, which I think is really hopeful, a lot of folks saying, okay, so if we don't like the plan and we don't like what's going on, then we'll need to come to the table with alternative solutions or crowdsource this in a way. And I think that's sort of where things have been. So it's taken, I think, as you say, the heart takes a little longer for this to sink in for everyone.
Krista?
Thanks. Yeah, and I think also, you know, a lot of folks, we live here in Vermont because we like small, we like local control, we like and believe, I think, that we can kind of barn raise together to figure things out. And so I think it's a lot of this also goes back to the fabric of who we are and how we see our communities. And so, you know, I think we've been trying hard to find ways to invite more people into the process of grappling with us. That's been really helpful, but I think we need, you know, kind of, we're going to continue to face a lack of trust if we don't continue to invite folks in to see this as a collaborative problem we're facing and going to try to figure out how to address together. And I do think a lot of that goes back to kind of who we are as this like brave little state.
Rob?
Yeah, at a 30,000 foot view, I agree. I actually completely agree with Don that, you know, the state and Floyd could probably attest to this, doesn't necessarily help us out with the way things align as we try to build a budget and predict, you know, for the future. And you know, we have to play within the rules of the game. I understand that, but there's a lot of levers that don't necessarily help us maybe more proactively address declining enrollment. At least that's my limited understanding. I think for our district, and I'm a new board member, I've been on for just a year, and I'm a new community member that moved into the district after sort of the district unified as of Act 46. And my sense as a young parent and a new community member that we're facing this obviously problem, but we have this extra layer where, unfortunately, the way it's sort of playing out is that our 5 towns, you know, are feeling tension amongst one another now, and instead of necessarily thinking that as a whole district. And And that's been something I've thought about, is like, what would this look like if all our 5 towns still had their own school board, and then Mount Abe, our middle and high school, had its own board too? Like how would this be different? I don't know if it would be, the process would be better, but that's something I've grappled with, because I think unfortunately there's building tension, and it doesn't necessarily help the conversation.
Sandy?
Oh, thanks. I think the question is, what are the obstacles to declining enrollments? Was that, I was really thinking carefully about one of the questions that you listed. The first one was, why are people, not living here? And it kind of made me think a little sort of bigger picture, because it made me think about declining enrollment comes from a change in our demographics, our population. And I think some of the obstacles are people truly understanding what's happening on a bigger scale to our entire 5 towns, and then how that trickles down to the school. So we're dealing with it down here because of the funding and the way that things are done, but what's really happening to our communities as a whole, and why. And I think sometimes if we have a better way of understanding how that's all playing out, I think it could help give a better understanding.
Sarah?
I think there's a real problem with the boundaries, and they're pretty antiquated. Like it should be fair, or you shouldn't be making a decision so much about where you live because of, that this isn't as good of a school district. To me, there's the heart of the problem. And as working in a neighboring school district that is one of the biggest school districts and is probably considered one of the best school districts, that's where the people then move. That's where the money goes. There's no declining enrollment where I'm a teacher, and I just get, I don't know if it's just a boundary thing, or like people want it. I guess that's my issue, is just where we draw these lines seems to not help the problem.
Yeah, I think you raise this really important, again, I'm not sure it's the most compelling in a large stakeholder setting, but at least for you all as leaders, one of the things I have seen from a distance, having watched this play out in Western Mass for the last 10 or 15 years, for example, you get this vicious cycle going. You've got declining enrollment. You have fewer resources. Your folks get spread thin. You can't provide all the services you used to provide, or it's harder to provide the new stuff, or staff have to wear more hats and travel in more schools, and they decide to leave to go to a place where it's a little easier. And guess what that does? It actually makes families with young children move out. And there's been a lot of research that says that if you're in this kind of drip, drip, drip of having to cut back, little less staff, slower to add things and services that others have added, seeing the scuttlebutt that Mrs. So-and-so left because she had to work in 3 schools and took a job 10 miles away and only works in 1 school. That actually doesn't happen instantly, it doesn't happen a month, but next year, the year after, it actually becomes a place that a few more people leave. And then the problem gets worse and it keeps going. So one of the things that is really important to keep in mind, that if you have this slow drip, the problem tends to get worse over time. And even though this tends to be a difficult process, a process that I think everybody should skip if you could, but you can't. But getting yourselves to a place in which you can have all those services, to expand, not just keep what you have, but expand what you can offer, and to be a place that is even better to work, that starts putting you on that different cycle of things getting better and easier year after year. So appreciated that story. Couple reflections on the challenges that you shared, and a lot of it makes sense. So one is this issue of distrust, disbelief. This is a really nuanced recommendation I want to give you. It is really important that people trust you. So that's like the obvious part. That's not the nuanced part. But it's not as important, and no insult to anybody, it is not as important that the people who absolutely in their heart and soul hate everything you are talking about. There is going to be a group of folks. Maybe they have lived in town for 3 generations, and that school is the most important thing, and they were captain of the football team, and there is simply no set of facts that is going to make some people say, whoa, we have a real problem, and some of the best solutions require us to do something that we'd rather not do, and your school won't continue in the way it has for the last 3 generations. So if you acknowledge that there is a small group of people, that it is probably going to be, their minds are made up because they so dislike what might have to be done, no facts will persuade them. But there is a much larger group of people who are also wondering whether this is really true, hoping it's not true, who have heard from friends, neighbors, have their own theories that this isn't as bad, or you've dismissed really good ideas. So one of the things that we have learned is you need to identify, sometimes by name, sometimes just generically, folks who are not supporting where you're trying to go, but who are open-minded enough that if presented, and they believed, and presenting facts is not the same as believing facts. Let me be really clear about that. But if they believe the facts, would be in a place to say, damn, I don't like this, but it really does seem it's like the best we can do. Those people are not your supporters currently, but they're open-minded enough. And that is a group that you need to win over. Because if you don't have them, it's very often there's not enough support to do anything up, and you're going to be forced to make that trickle of cuts, 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 cuts. So now the question is, if you want to go after that group, and mind you, there's another group that already believes you. These are the people you like to have the conversation with. They know there's a challenge, but it is that group that does not yet believe you, but is open-minded enough and is not so personally connected to this that they can't accept any facts. So what are the 2 strategies that we've seen that are most effective at bringing along those folks, open-minded but not wanting to follow you? Here are the 2. First and foremost, more than anything else, it is the school principal. It's not Excel. It's not running numbers. It's not having forums. It's not the memos. It's not the public statements. It's not the PowerPoints. It turns out that in every community in America, principals are the most trusted educational leaders. Having worked with principals and worked in Vermont, that is doubly true. Principals have more sway in Vermont than any state I've ever been in. And they have an enormous amount of sway in the other 49 states. I think that is because your schools are so historically located, 1 per town. I'm the principal of my town's school. I have that connection. So your principals are so central to winning over those who could be won over but are not currently supporting you. So now, how do you get principals on board? It's not just by asking them. Again, your principals, I've probably met some, I know I've met some of them. I haven't met all of them through the years. They're good people. And if you bring them to a school board meeting and ask them to support the superintendent, they will do that at a school board meeting. But when a teacher pulls them aside and says, what's going on? Isn't this crazy? And they kind of say, yeah, a little, or they roll their eyes and shrug, or worse, the conversations principals have in private are the most influential communication channels there are, and you're not going to be there. And so what we have found is that the only way you get principals to be really supportive in private when nobody is watching is that you have to go through 2 steps with them. The first is they need to believe there's a problem. I will tell you that, I've been in districts where literally the principals meet with town finance people, they meet with demographers, you make them wrestle with the budget, but you need to spend time with them for them to say, whoa, if we don't do something, I don't know what it's going to be, but if we don't do something, I believe my school and my kids are going to suffer. I believe that we're going to be cutting back services. I believe we're never going to be adding some of the things we need. We're going to lose good staff. But if the principals are not persuaded, because they are closer to this than anybody else, then this is a very uphill battle. So that's kind of part one. They need to believe there's a problem. Part of the way you will help them believe there's a problem is sometimes they even have to do the fact finding themselves. This is a very odd thing, but it's called joint fact finding. It's been incredibly successful, meaning that if 1 or 2 people in the central office run a forecast, or they go and somebody in the central office or the superintendent puts together some data, see, that's somebody else's data. How do I know it's really true? How do I know they really didn't not include this? And I don't even know what this is. So we have found that if the principals are actually part of the fact finding, they believe it. They believe it so much more than if they were told it. Now, this raises a challenge for the leadership, because most leadership teams want to protect the principals. They're really busy. There's a pandemic going on. And we're thinking, hey, we're going to help the principals by not dragging them to 19 meetings. We're not going to make them sit in front of Excel. We're not going to make them talk to demographers. We'll do that for them. And in 20 minutes, we'll share the findings. We saved them 4 hours. You did not save them 4 hours, because for the next 3 years, you're going to be debating this over and over and over and over again. And so the first key takeaway is principals are how the public comes to trust and believe you. But the steps you need to go through to get the principals there are both joint fact finding and really helping them believe there's a problem. That's kind of one part of principals. Then principals, like everybody else, they have their own theories. They have okay, now I believe there's a problem. They need to be part of developing options and wrestling with them. I remember I know it's a much bigger district, but I was working with a large urban district in which they had a huge budget deficit. They had seen their enrollment drop by 15,000 students, hadn't closed to school. And the superintendent and a team of experts from MIT came in, studied it, modeled it, came up with this very modest 6 out of 125 schools were going to be closed or repurposed. All the principals sat on the stage of the school board meeting. They're in solidarity with the superintendent. And right after the presentation, all the teachers are texting, and all the parent-connected PTA parents are texting the principals, who are texting back, yeah, this is a total BS plan. It stinks. These people are idiots. It took less than 12 hours for the school board to, just say, this is dead on arrival. The principals just didn't believe in it. We did a lot of work with the principals who started suggesting their own alternatives. And here's what was fascinating. their alternatives were completely impractical in this particular case. But we spent days and weeks modeling every one of them, listening to them, figuring out what they were thinking, showing them what would and would not work. And about, I'd say 6 months later, those principals were back in front of the school board saying, you know, these are terrible decisions, but these are the best decisions we could possibly do for our kids. And I got to admit, one of them said, I didn't always believe that, but there really weren't other things to do that were better. And so I want to talk about this other idea of wrestling with ideas, including ones that you may want to dismiss completely because you as a school board member, as an informed person, or as a district leader are saying to yourself, that won't work. So you know that, but they don't. Including, I know a couple of you mentioned today, wouldn't it be great if the state would give you more money? You know, Dave, you might know something about this. I don't think it's all that likely to happen, but I'm telling you, there's actually value. If a fair number of people think the state funding system is the problem, there is actually value in formally asking the state for more money, in actually having legislators come in, hear the plea, and then hear the, this is never going to happen. In fact, it's going to get worse. But what you're doing is taking a solution. Now, I'll say solution in air quotes, because I didn't really think the legislature was going to give you more money. But I knew that. Maybe the person who suggested it doesn't know that, or they're hoping that. And going down paths that are not likely to be successful is really, really helpful. One, it showed, and whether it's with principals or the public, it has shown people that you heard them. You didn't just dismiss them as, that's a crazy idea, even if you were thinking, that's a crazy idea. People need to be heard, and sometimes the ideas are not crazy. But you need to treat them well, research them openly, share back the findings. And I will tell you that it is not uncommon to have to research 12 or 15 alternatives. And I'll tell you that we were pretty sure 10 of them had no chance of getting us where we needed. But that's only because we had more insider knowledge than they did. And now put yourself in a principal's shoes or the public's shoe. You've made a recommendation, but I have in my head an alternative, one that is better, less painful, meets a lot of my psychic needs, and you're not doing it. Why should I support your decision? And you're saying to yourself, and maybe even to them, but your idea won't work. And I'm saying to you, I think it will. And that conflict, basically in almost every case I've ever been part of, when the community won't support a plan to deal with declining enrollment, it is because they have rallied around one or a dozen alternatives that they believe will solve the problem. And you haven't recommended it because you're pretty sure they won't. But that disconnect in knowledge and belief is what really stymies you. So let me just pause there. I'm just curious for people's reaction to two things that I've tried to gently hammer. One is the importance and the role of principals as the most powerful communicators, but it's what they say in private. And second is the value of researching and going down the path of plans that may not be successful, but some people really believe they will be, and you need to get them to a place where, as Andrew said, they get to acceptance, where they say, darn, I wish that would have worked, but it seems like it won't. I'm just curious as to people's reaction to those two strategies.
Steve? Oh, you're muted, Steve. Still muted, Steve. We can't hear you, Steve. You're on mute.
I hit it and then it didn't disappear. Sorry. So I think both of those topics are spot on. You know, amongst the folks that I've talked with, hearing not just from the principals but from staff that, you know, any ideas that they've had have been heard and have been discussed, is an important factor. And two, people rallying around an idea that may or may not work and getting enough information in front of them to get them to understand that that doesn't work, has been a challenge. Even if you can, in your own mind, having been wrestling with this for a while, understand in maybe 5 minutes that that plan probably isn't going to work. But having the resources and the time and the bandwidth to explain to each of these folks the details and the nuance of why it doesn't work can be a struggle.
This is very time consuming. That is I agree. Any other reactions?
Kevin?
I'm interested in the layers of, I'll call it debate for lack of a better word, but the layers that you have to go through with people to process through to the point of acceptance. You know, a case in point is the population decline. I mean, in our case, the administration came up with some numbers. Then we went out and they were not embraced. Then we went out and hired a regional consultant that came up with a set of numbers that were very similar. Those numbers weren't accepted. You know, there's still this, and then and with the population decline, there's some ambiguity with now that there's COVID, people are going to flock to Vermont. Now there's global warming, people are going to flock to Vermont. So I'm just curious about your experience with the level of depth that you have to go to work through some of these issues.
Yep. So great question, Kevin. So I think a couple thoughts. The first is, it goes back to, you got to take all of the players or community and put them in essentially 3 categories. There are people who already believe you. Some people, great. Don't have to spend a lot of time with them, but we often do. There are people who are so viscerally harmed by this. You know, this is going to be the worst thing to happen to them. You know, the quintessential, and this was true in one community, you know, 88-year-old guy who was the captain of the football team, had lived in town. He had worked in the school, his wife had worked in the school, his kids had worked in the school, and obviously his entire family went through the school. That person, I don't think there's anything that is going to get them to say, yep, we got a real problem and this is the solution. And so I want to think about, what do you need to do for the person who is not that person? Maybe it's their friend, maybe it's somebody who isn't with you yet, but is open-minded enough. And I think that there are 2 different ways in which you get that open-minded but not yet supportive person. And it's not, and it's, again, it's a surprising strategy. Most people, including that person, whoever he or she may be, don't want to meet with the demographer, don't want to come out to a public forum, you know, and they don't want to hear from the superintendent and the board who they didn't trust last month and they're not going to trust today. The way you persuade them is by identifying what are called trusted advisors. Every community has them. Principals are the most trusted, but again, I was in a community, actually it was a Vermont district I was working with, and it was a football coach. It was somebody who ran a local nonprofit. There are people in your community that other people go to for the inside scoop. There will be a teacher or two who other people look to and say, is this really true? And districts, even districts 20 times their size, actually create the list of names of the most influential folks in the community. And you ask them to go through the same process that the principals have gone through, meaning let them voice their concerns, let them float their alternatives, let them hear directly from the demographer. And what you will find is one of the attributes of being this kind of trusted person is that they will often invest time. They like to be the trusted person. That's part of the way you become a trusted person. They will work with you. They will go through 5 or 6 meetings if they're invited into this quote advisory group. And they're not a rubber stamp. Don't think at all, because they're not. They may be fierce pushback, but they and the principals go through this process of joint fact finding, of floating alternatives and having them researched. So they can go back out and say, and I've heard them, they go, whoa, you know, we just were so sure central office was bloated, and if we just cut it in half, the problem would go away. And they said, we actually modeled it. First of all, it's not bloated, it's smaller than other places, but even if we cut it in half, it wouldn't save us 1/3 of what we needed. And people go, really? And they go, yeah. And so like, not everybody needs to read the spreadsheet. But these trusted advisors are out there, and it is very common to work with them. And again, I can put principals at the top of the list, but there'll be other community members and other staff members who are also. And that's how you're going to move the open-minded, but not yet supportive.
Dave?
Well, thanks. Right after taking a bite of cookie. So yes, I think we need to learn how to listen better as a board and interact with the community in a way that builds trust. I think that's a serious problem that we're facing at the moment in the way of moving forward. I should have put that as one of the obstacles. So I think I was misunderstood or misspoke with regard to the obstacles. So I'd like to go back to that for just a second. I think one of the obstacles is this notion that centralization is cheaper and better. I'm not sure that that is necessarily the case. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, yes, we do have a perfect storm. And what I meant by repurposing all schools is that we have an opportunity here in crisis to reinvent schools. And I know that that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And your book makes outlines about how to go about it, but just reading it like, really, you think we can pull this off? You know, that would be a huge challenge for the board, for the superintendent, for the leadership, for the principals, and for the communities. But I think we need to do that. We need to reimagine all of our schools in a way that addresses our children's needs. Thanks.
Dave, if I could just follow up, and again, I don't want to layer more work on all of you, but I will say it is easier to get people to support something that is going to be great at the end than something that is simply not as bad as the alternative. I mean, very often people approach this as, let's do the least pain. Let's minimize the suffering. Let's not lose art and our reading teachers. These are all things that at the end of the day, and again, as a leader, I actually think that's very reasonable. If I was a superintendent, if I can navigate a storm and get through it, I think that was a good captaining of a boat. But that is it's very hard for people to put up with loss if all they get at the end is slightly less loss. So where we have seen, and one thing, and I know there's some of this already been discussed, if you want to get people excited, and this is a high word, I'm not suggesting it is easy, but I have seen, for example, people pair, hey, we're going, yes, this school might not be a school in your community tomorrow, but it is going to be a community center. Here are the things that you have wanted to do that you could not have done before, but now that you can. Or for the other schools, they're going to have an element of magnet school, or I've had some places layer in an element of, and maybe you already have it, but choice, but like interesting choice, where you say, hey, for the remaining schools, they're going to have themes. Certainly if you live in that town, you can go there, but if you're really interested in that theme and you're not in that town, you could go there as well. But the idea is to try to build, and I think, Dave, you touched on this, where the thing that you have after isn't just as good as what you have today or slightly more efficient, but it is significantly better. And sometimes that's where you're listening to the community to find out what would be like excitingly better and sprinkling that into the plan. Then people are voting for something good as opposed to the worst of evils, or is it the lesser of evils?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kristen?
Hi, Nate. Thank you. So as a board, we're certainly not at the point of having one solution that they all agree on and are putting forth at this point. And so obviously a lot of your suggestions are things that we might do. But my question is, when does the board start having positional discussions about what to put forward? Because I've been finding that at our meetings, they've been going really long because we're having positional discussions already about the information as it comes up. And it seems that it's slowing the process down. And should we just listen for a couple more months and then have the positional discussions? Because I think we're having positional discussions about many of the pieces that are coming in. And so I didn't know if you had any advice about the board process and not getting stuck at this point in the positional discussions until we're ready to make a decision about what we're going to put forth. Does that make sense?
I definitely hear the question, understand the question. So I think that if you think about board members, school principals, and community influencers, those are the three groups that have the greatest impact on what will or won't ultimately happen. You all have official authority, but those other two groups have unofficial authority that is quite honestly greater than your official authority. So I think the process for all three of those groups, you all as board members included, goes something like this. One, see if we got everybody believing there is a problem. And what are the steps you need to take around joint fact-finding and trusted advisors to actually just believe what is the scope and magnitude of the problem? And can we get some agreement on that? You won't get 100% agreement, but that's an important step. Second is idea generation. You are still, I know you've been at it for a while, but at least from what I've been hearing, reading, some of the stuff, Patrick, you've shared with me as far as what's taken place over the last year, you're still in the idea generation mode. They need to generate ideas, create a list. This is a judgment-free zone. There are no bad ideas. We actually welcome them. Then there is a research stage. And unfortunately, it's not the research of two people in central office, even though I know they can do it fine. But it is a more inclusive research stage where you come back and say, hey, here is the pros and cons, here's the pluses and minuses. Oh, here's a legality that would absolutely prevent this. And unless we can get new legislation passed, we can't do this. And we have even asked, hey, can we get new legislation? So I think you need to have a judgment-free evaluation of the alternatives. And then you come down to a relatively small number of things that meet a couple criteria. It actually solves the problem in a magnitude that is worth doing. And it is legal. Some of the details have been worked out. So like now you're down to a smaller list. And because what ends up happening, I feel, is you put 3 things on the table and you're trying to talk about them, but people are actually suggesting or advocating for a 4th. And so you're not really even talking about the 3 you have. So that is a process that I think can get you there. And I also believe that, and I want to share, if you don't mind, I know a couple of hands are up. I want to share one more slide of some of the things you might want to put on the list of things to consider, like that goes through that idea generation stage that you might not have thought of, the public might not have thought of, but these are some of the cleverer ways I have found people to deal with declining enrollment that ultimately did become the solution. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought they would carry the day. So like if they weren't on the list, maybe they should be. So if you can, are you okay if I share for 5 minutes or so? Great, thanks. We've talked about all that. Oh, one thing we actually have not talked about, I wanted to have this, we had this slide as in our discussion. One thing, nobody has mentioned teachers. Me maybe thinking, but nobody said, hey, the teachers are pushing back or people are worried about teachers. Everything I have ever seen, if you're going to be able to deal with declining enrollment, protecting all current staff is an excellent starting place. You just want to say that no one who's currently working here will lose their job from anything we're going to do. And whatever savings this is going to generate, you're going to do it through attrition. Attrition is your friend. Enough people, enough staff leave. But if you can start every conversation with a principal, with a teacher, with the community, not a single teacher, not a single administrator, a single para is going to lose their job as a result of anything that comes out of this process. That just, it allows you to have a more sane conversation. So that was one thing I did want to share. But there are, as we've said, very few people will support a hard decision if they don't believe that all the alternatives have been considered. They always end up voting for the option that's not on the table. That is the #1 winner in every decision, the one you didn't give them. So you have to give them, that's why you have to research it, even if you know it won't work. And a really important caution, and I don't think you've done this, at least from what I've followed, but please never do this. The draconian option. If we don't repurpose these schools, we will have 32 kids in a classroom. We will only be going to school 4 days a week, and we will not have after-school sports. People do this. Boards do this. They try to like paint this draconian picture of like horrors that will happen. And here's what people say to themselves. Yeah, I knew these guys were liars. So I definitely want people to know the truth and to have trusted advisors tell them it's true. But going too far, like that scare tactic always backfires. But here's some options that sometimes have worked, not always, but you might want to weave these into your planning, your analysis. So one is what I call weighted student funding. And that is, and I know this is often done on a state level, but so here's the thinking. The reason you all, in part, want to possibly repurpose some schools is you don't have enough money to run them all in the way that you want. That it is hard to provide all the services and all the things that you want. And you should be worried that you're going to have to start cutting things back, things that are really important. And there's a presumption there that maintaining all your schools will lead to a slate of offerings that aren't great. And when, as leaders, as central office folks, as school boards, you say, this is what this school would look like 3 years from now if we did not marshal our resources. People sometimes say, I don't believe you. So I've had districts determine, hey, we're going to give each school a certain amount of money, a certain amount for each kid, a certain amount for each student with disabilities, a certain amount if you have poverty, a certain amount, maybe more at the high school, but you're creating a formula that is within your current budget. It is linked to the number of kids and the type of kids there. So Dave, we're definitely addressing equity because it's not the same dollar for every student. And you're going to go to a small school and say, hey, you've got $272,412. And this other school has $392.43. And that's what we can afford in an equitable way. If it was up to you, teachers and principal, how do you live within that budget? Now, one of two things happens. One of three things happens. The principal immediately says, it's impossible, can't be done. And then this whole strategy fails because they didn't engage. Sometimes they say, huh, if we could do this, you mean our school stays open? And you say, yes, your school stays open because you as a board shouldn't mind. It is not more expensive anymore. It is equitably funded. And what I've seen, and it's just fascinating, is school-based teams start making recommendations that if you made, they would shoot down in a moment. But because they made them, I've seen anything from when the principal says, hey, I happen to be a certified art teacher and I'm going to pick up 2 sections of art, or we're going to share this way or share that way, or we're going to do this differently. Sometimes they really figure out a way to do it. And now you have an option where the community can say, yeah, we're good with that plan. And as a board, maybe you can be good with it because it is not taking resources from other schools that also deserve them, because you have equitably funded all your schools and the schools have figured out how to serve their kids. Or an interesting thing happens, and the principal in particular, but even some of the leadership's teachers say, whoa, if this is like the fair amount of dollars, we can't possibly run this school. Like this would be the worst school. I would never want to send my son or daughter to this school. And they go, whoa, I had no idea how much extra we are getting and taking away from other schools. So there are a number of nice things that can happen. Like they find an answer that you can live with, or they find like just how unfair and disproportionate the spending is to maintain the small school. So that is an approach that sometimes works and sometimes builds supporters, and sometimes people just won't even play. And you never know until you try. A second model is, and I know you already do some of this, but pushing sister schools to the extreme. And what I mean by that is you take a small school and a slightly larger school, you maintain them both, but you're going to drive the cost down to what it would have been if you had consolidated. And like you literally think of, like it's funny, a lot of larger elementary schools, you walk into the front door and there's like an A wing and a B wing. Like you literally go off to the left and there's like 8, 10 classrooms. You go off to the right, there's 8 or 10 classrooms. And in the center, there's a cafeteria and there's offices. But you've got these 2 little wings. And you've never had a principal of each wing. It's just one school with 2 wings. I've seen where they start to treat 2 schools physically apart as one school. And yes, it means you have one community of teachers. And yes, you have one principal, but you have faculty meetings together. You create a larger entity, it can be fairly efficient. Yes, you will still need custodial in both, but a lot of, and it doesn't feel like I am working in two schools. It feels like I am working in one school that has two locations. That is very different. It can be much more efficient. It can be a much better working environment. And it can be an alternative to repurposing a school. And again, if people say, hey, I would hate that, well, it's also a vision of what the future would be if you don't do anything. But this extreme sister school model can work. I've seen it work. There's also a variation on the sister schools. And this one I would never have believed could work, but it has. And it has been very well in some communities. So let's say I've got school A and school B, and school A is slated to be repurposed. There are districts that have taken school A and physically moved it to school B. Literally put in, two signs up front, school A, school B, had the corridors. This corridor is school A and that corridor is school B. The teachers actually stayed fairly separate. This idea of lost identity. Now, obviously this doesn't address the fact that the building is not in your community, and that is definitely an issue. But for some of the community members, the fact that their school name, their school is still there, the teachers are still a unit. I have been really surprised at how well this maintain the identity, maintain the cohesion, but physically move. And you have a sister school in which they're sisters because they share a building, but not much else. And then you have this first version of sister schools where they have two buildings, but share everything. And again, the interesting thing about that is either one of those options, sometimes it's a good solution for the next 5 years. And sometimes people look at it and go, whoa, we've even tried this and that still doesn't save enough. It's still going to force us to not do the things we want to do. And then they actually come around to believing, well, we have really investigated every alternative. And then the last piece, and again, this is an odd one in that sometimes it really upsets people and sometimes it doesn't. And that is what's called narrowing the grade span. It turns out, and this is just numbers you can run, but having, say, 5 K-5 schools is often very, very economically inefficient. And having, a couple K-2 schools and a 3-5 school, one district that had very severe declining enrollment, and I can't believe how well they liked this, actually took 6 schools and made it a grade 1 school, then the other was a grade 2 school, the other was a grade 3 school. You can figure out how this story ends. Yes, there were transportation costs, but it was actually pretty efficient economically. No community lost a school. It turned out to be like really nice for teachers to have multiple first grade teachers, because prior to this, often I was like the only first grade teacher there. Whether narrowing the grade span would make a big dent or a little dent in your budget, it's something worth looking at, but I've been very surprised that this model had again addressed some of the community senses of loss and addressed some of the economics. So let me just stop there. I wanted to kind of put those out there. One, because they've worked in some places. And if you're thinking they probably can't work here, you might very well be right. But it also goes to, the value of generating a pretty broad list of ideas from community, but especially from, and again, I'm not against like broad-based community input, but if you think about the 3 most influential groups, board members, principals, and those unofficial trusted advisors, if they've got a plan or the inkling of a plan, it is really valuable to surface it to study it objectively, to help them understand the ramifications. And then and only then do I feel like you're able to start to narrow it down to say, hey, these are the viable plans. And these are the ones we gave a really honest shot. Let me pause there. Curious thoughts, reactions to, and again, I hate saying this because I know you've been at this for a while, but the need to kind of create more plans, particularly those generated board members, principals, and community trusted advisors.
Krista?
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate this part of the conversation and hearing just even some of the options you put out there. I think we went through an option generating period, but I haven't really felt like it was fully baked or properly vetted by this more diverse group than our central admin folks and the board. And so I think there's great value in having a way to evaluate options with some key players, as you've mentioned. And I hope that we can implement something like that and have the board have a lot of transparency around what that looks like. And again, just a couple of the particular ideas you mentioned, it'd be great to know what that would really look like. And do they meet the goals and aspirations we have for being a great district moving forward? So thanks for that.
And I just want to, Krista, just want to add to it because in hindsight, obviously I've been extemporizing as we go tonight. I don't want to leave out the fact that as you're evaluating these alternatives, it has to be to get you to a better place. Not just, hey, this is a strategy that is not as bad as some of the other ones. And because I just believe you have to make this a win-win. There's going to be some pain, but it has to get you to even something better than maintenance mode.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I totally agree. I think we haven't done a great job both allowing more folks to be part of grappling the alternatives and then also with really articulating what it is we want to build. Mm-hmm. How to speak to that greatness we want for all of our kids.
Steve?
Yeah, I just wanted to step back for a second. You made a comment about how your plans are more likely to be successful if you could promise you weren't going to cut any staff. But I don't know if you've looked at the numbers we're looking at right now. It's pretty hard to imagine how we get to some of the savings we're looking at without there being, I guess it's estimated in 2013, 25 people laid off, and then up to maybe 75 to 90 folks by the time we hit 2026. That's a tough uphill climb.
It is. I have not obviously been deep into your budget, but generally, I think for the Vermont average that I've looked at is most districts lose about 6 to 7% of their staff each year. So it does say that in 3 years, a quarter of your staff may cycle through. And so, it doesn't, I'm not guaranteeing that you get to stay in your building. I'm not even guaranteeing you get to teach the same grade. And again, this is something that you would want to model before you make the commitment. But it is, to the extent you can take job loss out of the conversation, it is a lot easier for people to wrap their head and heart around some of these alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It's just, it's difficult to wrap my mind around the math, that's all.
I will tell you, Steve, that more often than not, attrition is sufficient.
And I'll just weigh in that I think with a plan that we know we're working toward, I would agree with that statement. And if I look historically, I would say in the last 3 years, we've reduced 40 positions, 35 positions, so we're talking about $2 to $3 million in savings by not filling positions and taking advantage of attrition. So when we think about that going forward, if we have a plan and we could not fill 10, 12, 14 positions a year, that would do most of it. What's really hard is to take advantage of attrition in the absence of knowing where we're going. Kristen.
Yeah, I want to very briefly just go back to something Nate said and just say to the board, and maybe we can discuss this more at our next board meeting, but we're sort of hopping back from, we did idea generation, then research, now we're back to idea generation. But as we're doing the research stage, you said, Nate, that the research stage should be a judgment-free evaluation of alternatives. And I hope that at our meetings, we can adopt that while we're at that stage. And then there will be a time and a place for positional discussions. So that's just what I took from what you said. So thank you for answering that, Nate. And I think, I don't know how we can address that either at this meeting or another meeting, but to try to do that going forward for that stage.
And I will admit, Kristen, that is, it's hard. I mean, I have, facilitated these things. I've been a participant. I've been in your seats during it. And, particularly some of you have more information than others. And in this stage of the process, that is a curse, not a benefit. Like I will tell you just one short example, but I was again, a larger district. And, there was this belief out there that if they just stopped paying for out-of-district travel, all these conferences, they wouldn't have to close any schools. And I remind you, as a school board member, I mean, I knew the budget inside and out, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm literally, as this person is talking, I'm literally running numbers in my head thinking, yeah, we don't spend $10,000 on that. And the $10,000 we spend is from a grant. It's like, I just wanted to say, yes, thank you so much, but that's stupid. Like that won't work. It's only $10,000. Like that is nothing. And like that is the worst thing to say. And I hate to say it. I think I may have actually said it back when I was a school board member. Because all that person knew was you didn't hear me and you didn't respect me. And what I really needed to do was thank them, say we definitely want to look at that, and then come back. And even we were literally publishing this on our website. Here is suggestion number 12, stop all out-of-district travel. Here are the receipts for all out-of-district travel, $2,408. Our goal was to save $1 million. This won't help enough, but thank you very much for raising that. And like that is such a different process than saying then and there, whoa, you are so far from, you're off by 99%. And so I do think creating ground rules that all of you can live by, that during the, particularly the idea generation and the objective analysis stage, you can't say it's a dumb idea. You can't start like throwing out the facts that you may already know, because whoever suggested it either didn't know those facts, didn't believe those facts, or had a different set of facts. And that process is a bear, because you got to treat every idea with respect, and then let ultimately the better ideas will surface.
Kevin?
I guess I'm sitting here thinking about some of the things we've done or attempted to do, and some of the things you're talking about that are very important to do. We've done community engagement for 18 months or maybe close to 2 years, and went through a whole facilities scenario analysis, and quite honestly, it didn't flush out a whole lot, but nonetheless, we've done that. The principals and there was a certain amount of staff that were involved in that, and I know Patrick has talked about discussions with principals through some of his planning, and and we're in the process of entertaining community proposals, which are kind of freewheeling and whatnot. So I'm trying to figure out how, and I don't know how much of this you actually have been of this background about, but I'm thinking that there should be a weaving process here as opposed to a start over process.
Yeah, no, you're definitely, this ship, what's the metaphor? This train has left the station. I know you're doing some of this and appreciate that. And I think it's the right path, but I do want to, I don't want to say this, I know this is a public meeting, but I'll say it anyhow. Having a public forum, in my experience, is necessary, but very seldom sufficient. I think for two reasons. One, it's hard to like think and plan in a large group. And two, not everybody you need there is going to be there. So you definitely need the public forum. But again, I keep coming back to three groups: school board members, principals, trusted advisors. You need small group meetings with, maybe it's one-on-one or groups of 2 or 3 to say, hey, member of this importantly influential group, what are the options you're thinking? And again, I don't know, I haven't sat in on any meetings, Patrick, you've had with principals. I know they like you, I've met some of them. But sometimes principals believe their job is to support the superintendent, support the leadership. And if you don't give them like permission and space and information to say, no, don't react to my plan. What would your plan be? If you were in my seat, what would you want to do? What would you think we should be considering? Because I don't know if they always, sometimes you really got to pry the ideas out of them. But if you don't, it's hard to get their full support. Again, their full support when nobody else is in the room. And again, maybe you've already done that, but maybe, and again, and then identifying those trusted advisors in the community. And like literally people sit around a table and start to name them. You need a written list of these are like 25 of the most influential people in our communities. And you definitely have to have a one-on-one or 2 or 3 small group meetings. Ask their questions. Do you believe we have a problem? How would you solve it? Do idea generation with them. You put 25 of them in a room or in a public meeting, maybe 2 or 3 talk. We know whoever talks first often sets the agenda. Somebody puts an idea and it gets attacked. I know there's at least 10 people who don't want to be attacked, so they're going to go home with their idea. So again, Kevin, I don't want to minimize what I believe has been very sincere efforts at public participation. You don't want to, it was good you did it, but what I'm hearing in this conversation is probably more is needed to get the level of support, to get people to abandon ideas that should be abandoned, to surface ideas that should be considered. And one of the questions that we didn't touch upon, but can be helpful as well, is in the communities that are most likely to see a repurposed school and not like it. And again, you need to win over the open-minded, and not all of those people I just described will be open-minded. But the question is, what is their second best option? And that typically requires a quiet setting and often multiple meetings. Like in the public, if I'm in one of those communities, what I want to say is, don't repurpose my school. Let me say that 10 times. Let me say that loudly. And if you ask me again, because I'm in the public, I'm going to do it louder. Sometimes in private, you're in a quieter setting and multiple settings, as I hear that. And we're going to look at alternatives. But if we did, what would you want it repurposed as? What would having that school, but being in a physically different building, work for you? I was literally in a meeting where somebody suggested that. And I thought it was the craziest idea. They were going to move, quote, the school 9 miles away, put it on the 2nd floor, enter through the back door. I thought it was an insult. And the community loved it because the tradition carried on. So sometimes you need to create the public forum, just at least in my experience, is not it's not where the best thinking happens. I don't know whether you agree or disagree or what your experience has been.
Krista?
I agree that there have been a lot of times where I've wanted to just talk to a couple of people at a time about some of these things. And so I really like the idea of the, honoring the expertise and experience of principals and some folks in our community. What I'm wondering about is that board members going and having those conversations? Is that the board encouraging our superintendent to have those conversations? Because we get into this situation where we want to all make sure we're hearing the same thing, and where we want to make sure we have clearly defined role. So logistically, we get caught in we trip ourselves up around that.
Yep. So I think that's a really good question. It's a tricky one. So here's what I know we don't want to do. So some things are easier to answer in the negative, which gives you enough time to work through the positive. Here's what you don't want. Individual school board members going out and doing this on their own. That is disastrous for a couple of reasons. One, try as you may, you will share slightly different stories, slightly different facts, and you won't, everybody needs to hear the same thing. As far as like, what is the challenge? What are we trying to address? So having a small army of people go out, tends to sow confusion, and you each, whether you know it or not, are a filter. And you all have baggage. You all have a point of view. And that will filter. And so, Krista, if you're sharing some ideas, people are going to be wondering, Andrew's going to be wondering, Don's going to be wondering, hey, is that Krista's idea or Krista's filter on what we heard? So we got to eliminate the mixed messages going out and the filter coming back. So what have I seen? I have seen there are districts in which the superintendent and the central office are considered completely neutral in this, not going to spin it. And yes, that is their job, and you can task them to do that. I have seen where people say, hey, and the surveys are nationwide, central office is just not trusted as much as others. I don't know why that is, but it is true. And you put together like a 4-person team, where maybe it's a superintendent, maybe it's a principal, maybe it's a board member, and maybe it's somebody else who needs to be there. But it's a small group. It can't be all of you. But it's a consistent group so that the message going out is the same. It's funny. I know some larger districts have tried to hire the community outreach company to do that. That's a disaster. These are principals, these are community members. These conversations have to be with folks from the community who have a vested interest. Outsiders can advise you, but these kind of conversations have to be within the community, in my experience. So maybe you're looking at a team of 3 to 5, but a consistent team and a cross-functional team.
Sandy?
Thanks. No, I'm finding a lot of these ideas very interesting, definitely stimulating other ideas and thoughts.
That was the goal for the evening. So we're gonna have mission accomplished at some level.
No, it's great. I loved the examples of what some communities have done and how creative they were, and I imagine the work it took to try to really to actually implement it, and actually it sounds like managed to be somewhat successful, because you're telling the tale here, so they weren't they weren't total failures.
There is a path through this,
right? And so I appreciate the opening, just to say we need to hear it, we need to really consider all these things, because who knows, right? Every community, we're not unique, but yet we are. And so the other piece is that I like the idea of a smaller trusted group working and really digging from the different I love the idea of principal participation, with administration, with school board trusted advisors. I'm wondering if the group could be a little bit bigger than 3 to 5, just because we're not a huge community anyway, you know, in terms of members. And so what's really effective. But I would agree, there's always a challenge when you're a very large group, when you're actually really trying to figure out possibilities and explore things. It can be very difficult, you know, and so to the extent that we're able to do that with the way our structure is in our board and our community, I think that's a positive. I think but it's important that it still feel to everyone involved is still being transparent. So I feel like there's a balance that needs to be achieved.
So I said, one way to perhaps modify what I've said, move a little more, is there is, if you think about the steps, it's idea generation. I do believe it's like 4 people, cross-functional, because you need a real dialogue, and you don't want posturing, and you want people to feel safe. And I think the more the numbers in a room, I find the more people you have in a room, the less conversation you have. You have more speech making. So I think a small group to generate the ideas. I think you could expand that group some to evaluate the ideas. So if you have a couple more principals, couple more key stakeholders, maybe a couple more board members who are like running the numbers and validating the numbers and thinking it through, because that's a working group. And I've seen groups of 8 be fairly efficient at getting work done. But I don't think that a group of, imagine 8 of you sitting across from one principal. That is not a setting in which a principal is going to be vulnerable, at least in my experience, and really tell you what they're really thinking, even though maybe he or she is afraid you won't like it. So
I love the idea of creating safe spaces for people to really speak all kinds of ideas without feeling the need that there's a sense of retaliation, perceived or real, right? And so I love that if there's a way of managing that. I think that's a great idea.
Kevin, I want to check to see that your hand is up from before, that it's not a new hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's up from before.
Okay, no worries. And Don, before I start calling on others, I'll look to your direction. We have a community member with their hand up. Do you want to wait until the end for public comment, or do you want to call on folks now? I'm also cognizant it's just about 8 o'clock.
That was my first question. Nate, are you on track with your part?
I am. So I've shared with you the thoughts that I wanted to share and had the conversation that I was hoping to have. If people have more questions or want to continue it, the beauty of Zoom is I'm already home. So I'm not driving back from Vermont tonight. So if people want to either throw some more questions at me, or I'm happy to stay if you've had sufficient and you're ready to move on. I have covered what I was hoping to cover with you tonight.
Do board members mind if we take reflections from a couple of community members at this point? Okay, so let's like 2 or 3 or 4, see how many people want to share their thoughts.
Okay, Nancy?
Thanks. This has been so interesting. But I'm interested in going back to that first part of the process, Nate, the part about agreeing on the nature of the problem. I think that one of the obstacles that wasn't mentioned at the beginning is that there's some question about the assumption. I mean, when you're planning for the future, you have to make some assumptions about what's going to happen. And also the sands keep shifting. I mean, who knew that we were going to get $4.9 million of ARPA funds, things like that. But there are other assumptions about whether our decline in enrollment is an immutable problem or a problem that can be influenced. There are assumptions about what is the legislature going to do, given that the problem we're facing is a problem that's not just happening in our school district. So I'm just curious about what your recommendations are about how to approach the assumptions, and also to approach things like the fact that sands do shift. The legislature changes the yield. They take construction out of the equalized pupil formula. I mean, there are all kinds of things that also change the picture, can change the picture in big ways.
Yeah, so great question, Nancy. And so I've seen two different approaches. Now, the most common approach in the K-12 world is people debate the most probable scenario. And, it's probable, it's not guaranteed, and it's what most people think is most likely to happen. And that's the K-12 solution. And it tends to sit poorly with some, because they're thinking, hey, but that might not be what happens. And if that didn't happen, I hate this plan. But if that did happen, I guess I would have to live with this plan. So what in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector, it's scenario planning. And so what people do is what's called stage decision making. They say, hey, if our enrollment drops to 800 or whatever the number is, this is what we're going to do. And if it drops to 600, this is what we're going to do. And if it went back up from 600 to 800, this is what we're going to do. Because I don't know what's going to happen, but if I knew for sure that you're going to lose 200 more kids, you could figure out what to do then. But you don't want to wait that long. So in scenario planning, you actually create 3 or 4 scenarios, and you don't debate which one's going to happen. You just say, let's assume for tonight we lose 200 kids. Well, when we hit that threshold, I'll tell you a real quick story if I can, because I was on a school board and we had a different problem. We had many problems, but one of them was runaway growth. Runaway growth. We were building new classrooms every 2 years. We'd put on 3 or 4 wings. The buildings were getting really big. We were running out of space. The last classrooms are more expensive, and again, I'm bearing my soul. So we got to build another school. And this is just crazy. And other people, pretty fiscally conservative towns, said we're not spending a penny. And basically what we then went into for 2 years was a debate over what is the projection for enrollment, which was all just a proxy for, I thought we needed to build a new school and others didn't want to spend the money. But they kept saying, I'm for building the school, but I don't think the enrollment's going to come. So we ended up essentially making a decision that if our enrollment hit this level for 3 years, or if our kindergarten and first grade classes hit this, we would then begin the feasibility study on the school. We can all agree, because we're only doing it if certain things happened. To my shock, enrollment dropped by 700 kids. I mean, it would have been the single worst decision as a school board member, would have been to build that school. And I advocated because my facts said the rate of growth was we had so much undeveloped land. We were a very hot community. Turns out nobody wants to live in the outer burbs of Boston anymore. So, but the scenario planning solved the problem, because we decided what we would do when certain things happened, and then they either happened or didn't. And it was a much better conversation. And it did mean that you made some decisions in stages, but I found that it bought peace. And in this case, it turned out to be a really much better decision than I and many of us had advocated.
Coco?
Hi, Nate. Hi, everybody. Nate, I want to kind of go back a little bit to your comment on trust, on building trust in communities. And one thing that, kind of stuck out for me in the conversation was that we didn't touch on the articles of agreement that form the basis of the school district. And so I'd love to hear from you just a little bit about, how we navigate those articles of agreement so that we are building community trust, that we are building a sense of respect for the founding kind of principles that towns voted on when they voted to, come together as a unified district.
That's a great question and a hard one. So I've certainly read many articles of agreement in Vermont. I don't believe I've read yours. But I think that, to me, the issue that raises beyond the very specific articles of agreement is, and I know a number of people mentioned it, this conversation we're having about declining enrollment, it's complicated because back to the perfect storm, because you've already been through the Act 46 part of life, which was it's an emotional, not entirely beloved by everybody. I was a big part of that effort, so I've seen it from all sides. You have that legacy. And so I think we can't ignore that. I think that, part of this goes to, acknowledging the loss and acknowledging, what expectations were at the time of voting this. But I also think it goes to getting agreement, that shared understanding of what is our future. And in some ways, there's definitely what did we hope to do when we came together? And there's also the other discussion of, okay, but where are we today and where are we going to be in 4 years? And both of those are really important. And again, I think that I don't want to minimize that people had expectations when the articles were signed. We need to listen, but we really do need your district, not mine. You need a plan going forward. And I think that's where, having as many of the alternatives out there, including, if people can generate alternatives that reflect a particular set of expectations, they should be heard, and they should be embraced, they should be studied, and they should be evaluated equally along with other alternatives. But I definitely hear that it just adds another layer of complexity to how people are going to feel about this.
I think it's really core to building trust and support across the towns. And when it sort of gets negated in some sense, or held up for, well, is it legal? Is it not legal? Can we change articles of agreement? It really starts to erode that process of trust. And I think if you want to build a set of trusted advisors across all of these towns and bring in community members and select board members, there seems to be a certain kind of standard that all these community members would like to see upheld in order to participate in a conversation.
And I think it goes to, there are, at least at the beginning, there are no bad ideas. And we need to capture them, hear them, capture them, appreciate them, and then evaluate them. And there may be ideas that surface that really embrace what some folks really hoped or expected from those articles, or you find that, yep, it's what you agreed to, it's not what you hoped for, but the world has changed. I think one of the things about communication, which is really, really hard, and which is why this is such a hard process, is for school and district leaders, they have a lot of information, and they have they see what the future could hold. They're in this day in and day out. They have a different set of depth of understanding than some other folks. And it doesn't make them better or smarter. It just means what they do for their day job is this. And I think, and it's certainly a mistake I have made, is in the early stages, using my internal knowledge to say, hey, thanks, Coco, but that won't work. You can't do that. We shouldn't do that. We just need to really try to embrace and open up to as many ideas at the beginning, evaluate them all, and then be honest about what can and can't get us to where we want to go. But I suspect that for some of the folks who might be saying, hey, it's not what the article said, or we want to change the articles, that perhaps some of those avenues, maybe I haven't been in any of the conversations, just get shut down a little quicker than people will want them to be shut down. And maybe they shouldn't be shut down at all, or maybe they need to be, but every idea has got to be welcomed. Every idea is going to be studied objectively. I think you need to, and again, important that trusted community advisors are part of the idea generation and part of the evaluation.
Nate, that idea of of objectively studying the options that come up has come up a few times tonight, and I think that makes a lot of sense. What also has come up is the pretty significant amount of time it takes to do that, and that raises capacity questions. But I also wonder in our particular example where I have put forward a recommendation and that has been met with, to say the least, mixed reactions, right? In our circumstance, what makes sense, or what have you seen work in terms of vetting those options that come forward? Because we're going to be receiving some additional options. Be good to hear your thinking.
Sure. So I think that you need, that's a great question, Patrick. And I think you need the following to vet them. You definitely need, so first of all, it's not one person to do the vetting. You know, I told you that, and I forget who I picked on, we all bring, every one of you brings a lens and a perspective, and you can't help yourself. So one is, it can't be an individual. I definitely believe part of the vetting has to include you and your CFO, because there are just facts and numbers. There's a technical side to this that has to be right. I think that having, you know, whether it's some board members or even like, if I recommended an option, maybe I am part of the vetting process. Like I am literally being shown the data and saying, no, that's not what I meant. Or no, why don't you just do that? And you can at least share, well, because that's illegal. Or a collective bargaining agreement doesn't allow it. But so I need to think through a little bit more about how do you build the right vetting process, but it's not one person. It's not just you in the central office. I've gotten a lot of this experience because people bring in outsiders as a neutral third party. Whether it's me or somebody else, I got no horse in this race. I don't care what you do. I don't live in town. And I can be, or I or somebody in my role can just say, no, that's illegal. And, or yes, you shut that one down too quickly. And I don't see any reason why this couldn't happen. Or here's a catch, here's a problem you see, but here's a way around it because this is how somebody else got around it. So I do think having, and this is a very common use of folks like me in my role, is just a neutral third party who really, I don't live in any of the towns. I just, or any third party just wants to give you good information, objective information that can help people say, hey, are these numbers correct? No, they're not. Or isn't there a way around this? Yes, there is. So I think it's some, again, you'll notice there's a recurrent theme here though, and it's not because I'm short on ideas. It is, you need what I would call small cross-stakeholder teams. You need folks with different roles, different perspectives, but also different constituents. You can hear the voice of the principal, you can hear the board, and I want to be, respectful to the board. I have been on boards where you kind of know like who's for it and who's against it. And if you kind of know that, then this evaluation team better have one from the fors and one from against on the team, on this evaluation team. So it really isn't, you're not trying to quote, stack the deck. You need to have the different perspectives there, but it cannot be 18 people. Those are just, like people do that because they think they're gonna hear all the voices. You really don't. you hear one or two voices and a lot of people very quiet. So it's a small cross-functional team. I think, Sandra, you asked that question about like evaluation. Right, again, I think the generation is like 4 people. I think the evaluation could be 8 or 9. I don't think it could be much more than that. I do think it's fair to bring in what I call an ad hoc member. Like if I'm the principal who suggested something, yeah, I think you should probably show them how you're evaluating it. Let them say, no, no, that isn't what I meant, or whoa, because they would have a voice. They don't need to be at every meeting, but they get brought back in. And I do think just an objective third party helps with consistency and might help with is there a lens that people are evaluating it through that distorts it a bit.
So would the objective third party be a member of the 8 or 9 group of 8 or 9 people?
Yeah. Or a member advising them. It could be the third party plus, but I think you need, there are different ways of structuring it where in one district, we were asked to like literally do the heavy lifting of the evaluation. And again, that is not my recommendation entirely, because now it's the outsiders, and I think being like a thought partner and maybe reviewing data or helping in some aspects, I would need to think through roles and responsibilities, and obviously they need to be clear, but I don't think you want to subcontract it completely, because one, they'll get it wrong and they don't have the credibility. So there's nothing more credible than you knowing yourself how this was evaluated, what was considered, what was the conversation, especially if it turns out your idea is not actually viable. And that's going to be true in many cases. And so, if it's done in the biggest mistake people make, and it is what I call the mistake of smart people, that a couple smart people go off and do all the hard work. And it's like really hard, and they did a really, really good job. And they actually come up with a really, really good answer. And people don't say, thank you for all that hard work. All they say is, I disagree. Because they weren't there for it. They can't vouch for it. And so adding this process that builds trust on top of the technical skills is the winning combination. It's slow, it takes time. I really wish it didn't. But just if I can be fair, my sense that part of what you have done is very common, where I think, Patrick, you and your team have wrestled with this on behalf of others. And I know the board has wrestled with it as well. But in your doing that work for them, I'm sure it gives you sleepless nights, but it actually probably came up with a thoughtful, logical answer, but not a process that builds all the other things that need to be there, even if the answer is right. Remember my opening line, and I'm going to stop talking because I know it's getting late. The places that have successfully addressed declining enrollment are not those who came up with smarter plans. They came up with a smarter process. Because like getting the good plan is actually not the hard part of this. How we could lock ourselves in a room for 2 days and come up with 3 good plans. That you can't, but that's a terrible process.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Sandy?
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you for that, Nate, and thanks, Patrick, for chiming in. I want to say that.
I'm sorry, if you're, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Sorry. Darn it. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Ken, or I can.
Okay, great. Sorry, I took out my earphone. I had the wrong one in. I wanted to thank you guys both because, I'm a lawyer, and I do litigation. And in the years I've done, it always comes back to process. So when you said that at the beginning, it actually spoke to me, because people are always like, what's concepts of justice? How do we know something was something that was correct? Well, sometimes you have to have a certain process that allows for trust that certain things have occurred so that people can come along. So I appreciate that. And I also think
I know just from my past work with Patrick, and I'm sure his team, they've worked incredibly hard at trying to find good plans and solutions to try to solve what is apparently obviously a very difficult problem. And so I just want to say that I really support all the work that has already been done. But I also appreciate sort of this view of how do we look back at the process and incorporate all of this together so that we can bring the whole community, into the process in a certain way so that they can also trust it. I absolutely think that's essential. And I totally appreciate that this board, before I joined it just recently, I think took that huge step by saying, whoa, we need to take some time to consider really, what steps we're taking. This is a big wake-up call. And I really do think a lot of community members have also really joined in and really are participating because they too want to make sure that this is a process and they do appreciate how difficult the issue is. So I just wanted to put that out there that I do appreciate all the work that's been done and that we have a lot of work to do. And I think we're prepared to do that. Oops.
I'm not seeing any other. Oh, there's a hand. Sarah LaPearl.
I really appreciated the staged decision-making concept for us. And, I think sometimes, or some parts of even the proposal that have already been suggested, maybe flip-flopping some of the concepts might actually, be a start in the right direction, and even just sequence of how we go about stuff will be helpful. So I appreciated that thought process there. Thanks.
Steve?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've struggled with all along is
Oh, you've gone mute on us, Steve.
It does seem like one of the things that we've struggled with over time is the timeline and how much time we have to make these decisions, and the fact that well, obviously COVID jumped into the middle of it, but Montpelier has a large part to play in what we're doing here, and they're considering many options while we're having this discussion. So what could possibly happen if we waited, to find out what Montpelier was going to do in the next session or two? But do we have the time to actually do that? So trying to come up with a reasonable plan to address the most probable outcome while a lot of things are swirling, I think has been a struggle that a lot of people people have asked us to delay this and wait until we are more firm about what's going to happen in the future. And that's been a conundrum.
Dave?
I just want to thank Nate for being here and giving us some new thought processes and different perspectives and ways to look at this process that we're going through. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, I definitely empathize with you. You've got a very hard job ahead of you. I know they pay you the big bucks to be on the board, and everybody thanks you for everything you do and all those hard decisions you make. I have sat in your shoes. But I come back to closing thought when your opening icebreaker, virtually all of you put kids first. And that's what makes this worth doing. You are wrestling with declining enrollment because you want to be able to ensure that you can help your kids have the best possible education, the best possible outcomes. And I think with the right process, the right amount of time, but it is a lot of work. That is the one really lousy part of that. But I think you can get there. There are, as I said, it is hard but not impossible to get to a good outcome, an outcome that the community can accept. So hope I gave you some new ways to think about it, or I'm happy to come back and visit in the future if you'd like.
Thank you,
Great.
Nate.
Thank you very much, Nate.
All righty.
Right.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye, Nate.
Thanks. Wow. I'll probably be up tonight, sometime in the night, thinking about something I heard tonight. It's gonna take me a little while to process everything. A lot to think about.
So Patrick, do you, have we outlined the next step with Nate? That's one thing I'm not sure we really touched on.
No, we haven't. And I think it's good that we haven't. I think tonight's conversation could inform the way in which we choose or perhaps choose not to engage with Nate going forward. Certainly, I think he brought a wealth of experience and expertise to the conversation tonight that it makes sense to me that we tap into that expertise going forward. I'd love to have some conversations to hear your thinking about what that could look like. And I can communicate that with Nate and draft a sort of proposal to advance forward. But I think there's some conversation that this board should have about what that should look like so we can include that in the proposal. And to your point earlier, Steve, how does that, our learning from tonight and our thinking about working with Nate going forward, impact the timeline that we currently have in place? Is another really important conversation.
Yeah, especially if we were going to backtrack a bit and try to look at some of the, or generate some more ideas from groups that may not be feeling like they want to participate in our current formal proposal path. You know, I think we've been talking about maybe there was a principal and staff, maybe not a formal proposal, but at least an idea chalkboard or something that we would be encouraging folks to throw Post-it notes up on or something so we could see those ideas along with the formal proposals. And whether that's possible to shoehorn into this process in the time that we have remaining is a question.
Sandy.
I was wondering if the board found it appropriate if Nate could be more specific in helping us, Patrick, determine what a small cross-stakeholder team, you know, that small 4 to 5 with your thoughts and the team's thoughts, like what he would really think would be good players for that, you know, given the makeup of our district. And I'm wondering if that can be something that's just that goes alongside or with our current process, you know, and that can help guide it a little bit too, because you're going to have, I really actually appreciate Nate recognizing how hard it is to make decisions as a big school board and how sometimes real movement has to be in these smaller groups as long as they're transparent or, you know, are open enough so that people feel like they're still participating in that process, but at the same time giving them freedom to really work out some difficult, you know, issues, and then they can help guide us also when we're looking at everything else that's coming in.
Yeah, where my mind was going with that, Sandy, is in particular toward the end, as Nate was talking, I was wondering about Nate wearing sort of 2 hats, almost serving two roles for us. So one being sort of a process facilitator, and another being an advisor to the evaluation team that he was referencing, right? So he brings sort of the process expertise and experience. And we'd have to think about how does that dovetail with the work that we've been doing with Sue for so long. And then they feel different enough that that could be something that could work there. Then also the technical advisor, like he can weigh in on the numbers and bring that sort of third-party neutral perspective with expertise from his background and some resources at his disposal in terms of additional personnel. Those were the 2 thoughts that were coming to mind for me.
I kind of like that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Dave.
So this is a lot of work between now and August if we actually think we're going to do something in August. And I think we need to find a way to form one or more than one groups to find a way to meet with principals, either individually or collectively, and get their input to meet with proposals that we've gotten to see whether they should move into serious evaluation and involve the makers of those proposals in discussions about getting to whether they should be delved into deeply, and then they should be part of delving them in. So delving into deeply, so that when the final or along the process where it's being vetted, they come to an understanding that that it works or doesn't work. And maybe by having more than one group, we can whittle this down more quickly than having a single evaluation team that tries to perform all these functions before some sort of retreat that we might have in the middle of summer. Those are just some ideas that cross my mind.
Okay, I'm personally feeling like maybe a little more time, maybe Patrick and I and Krista can have a conversation, because I think there's some key pieces like the timeline that need to revisiting the timeline, and then sort of next steps. We have a meeting in our regular meeting in 2 weeks, and maybe we can have something pulled together to kind of give us some direction by then. Does that seem to work for Sandy?
Thanks. I think any of that I think sounds good. I was thinking about what Patrick said about, and I don't know how we would access this if the board needs to take action on some motion at our next meeting, but I do like the idea of having someone of Nate's expertise helping us with the process. So exactly what Dave was suggesting, like, could we break this into, 2 groups, given a look at how we are doing things currently and how far we've come. And I could just see Nate helping us to kind of formulate, using his expertise, what would be some good ideas, so that when we have our board meetings, we have some options that we can say that makes sense. I appreciated his, again, clearly by the work that he's done, he really knows a bunch about a process and all the different types of possibilities. And it's a matter for us, like, to choose as a board what makes sense, for us. So to the extent that maybe, Dawn or, with Krista and Patrick, you guys can think about how you think, if we use someone like Nate, how best we could, effectively and efficiently do that. And then I would also think that that Nate or someone of his expertise would be able to help us build that timeline, like a realistic timeline, for us that hopefully still meets kind of what our pressing needs are, taking into effect what our current is, and then saying, well, I think we could do this, but it would involve this work and commitment.
I agree.
I guess one thing that would be helpful for me to be able to help the board and help support this process would be to get a sense tonight if we are still on the same page, that we want to work with Nate in some capacity to help with this process, and we have some details to figure out exactly what that looks like. If I had that confidence tonight, what I'd like to be able to do is reach out to Nate, really get him on the hook, let him know we're trying to figure out exactly the way in which we want to work together with him, but start that process and get him thinking about penciling us in, and making sure that's clear in his mind that we do want to work with him, and that we'll evolve our thinking around how that would work.
I see a thumbs up. Do you want to give a thumbs? Oh, Liz has her brown dog consulting form cards. Yeah, I think I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up, Patrick. I think we are in support of that.
Dawn, can I just jump in with a quick comment?
Sure.
So I think that sounds like it makes good sense, Patrick. And I'm wondering if Nate knows that we're courting him to work with us more, if he might also be able to provide a better idea of what that could look like before we meet again. So maybe, you and Don and I could try to synthesize what we heard and then add to it what he envisions the best role for him would be. And then we could have some sort of action on our agenda on the 27th to move forward. Maybe it won't be totally fleshed out, but at least we know where we're heading.
I think that's doable. I think so. Steve.
And Krista, not to throw something in your lap here, but when Nate was talking about having a small group do like little fact-finding interviews with smaller groups of community members, if there was a group in the board right now that I think has a lot of trust in the community, it's your community engagement group. And if that group as a smaller body was plugged into that initial process of talking to smaller groups of people, in my mind, that's what it brought up when he was talking about that process.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some overlap there. And I think, it would be good to figure out how to marshal that community or that committee to help with some of this, whether it's identifying trusted community advisors or reaching out in small groups, or, because we have dabbled in some of this a little bit already. So I was thinking in my head, well, when will our community engagement committee meet again? And how much will we know about this before that next meeting? And ideally, we would be meeting the first Tuesday in May, which would be after our next board meeting. So it might work out well for us to be able to talk in that committee a little bit more deeply about some of those pieces.
Well, the other thing that I was thinking about, Krista, is we've identified those trusted individuals. We did it at Bristol Elementary that day. And we put names to positions.
Yeah,
and
exactly. We also had the meeting with select board members and community leaders. So I do think that some of the groundwork has been laid and could be tapped into and, used in different ways. So yeah, I think once we get a little more clarity, that could be a good home for some of this.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep moving along so that we can be done on time tonight, I'm hoping. So our next is an action item to appoint an individual to fill the Starksboro vacancy. So I just want to give you, we expected more than one applicant by what we were hearing from that community. I was in contact with the select board chair. She had heard of multiple people interested, but when the time came down for people to send letters, we received one. So the original plan was with multiple applicants to have a interview process where we could ask some questions and get some answers and just have a conversation with the people interested. But when you only had one, it didn't make sense to have that meeting. And so I talked with the select board chair. She was in agreement that with only one, we could, it made sense to just go ahead and appoint, and that we have an interested party. So that if we appoint that person tonight, they will fill the position until the next regularly scheduled election. And then if they decide they wish to remain to fill the remainder of the term, then they would have to run at the next scheduled election for the remainder of the the term. So, but in the process of all that, I did develop a list of questions, and we can use that in the future when we put a letter out saying, hey, we have a vacancy. Here's some kind of information we'd like to hear from you about. Like, can you answer these questions? Or what can you tell us in relation to these questions? So I just wanted to let you know that the work had been done with in contacting the select board and, you know, getting some questions. And we just had one applicant this time. So we just need a motion to appoint the individual to fulfill the vacancy. And then if you have any questions beyond that, we can go from there.
So moved.
Okay, and that's Brad Johnson. Okay, and who is the second?
Dave.
Dave, okay. All right, any comments? Okay, not seeing anybody. Okay, all those in favor of appointing Brad Johnson to fill the Starksboro vacancy, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that one passed. We are not in need of an executive session. Is there any public comment at this time? Looking to see. Okay, not seeing any hands. Okay, Chris, by chance, do you have the evaluation up?
I do.
All right, go.
So what is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low?
Aye.
Was the agenda followed, yes or no? Was the chair effective, does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Any comments? Alrighty then. Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process?
Thumbs. Yep.
Any comments? Other feedback for the chair? What went well with the meeting?
Great speaker.
Yeah, great speaker. Thanks, Patrick, for bringing him to us.
That was great.
What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
In person.
The length of this one was lovely.
The length was lovely.
Mhm. Thank you for that.
All right, that's a wrap.
Okay. All right. And so just drawing your attention to the agenda for tonight, that our next meeting is Monday, April 26th, and it's the joint meeting with Addison Northwest School District. We're going to run it like we used to run our old carousel meetings. So please be patient because they have people, they have to run their meeting. We have to kind of take turns going back and forth, and it'll be a great chance to introduce ourselves to each other and have a conversation. And Rob, you had your hand up. Okay. All right. How about a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Steve?
I'll
Right.
second. Andrew.
Andrew? All those in favor of adjourning at 8:44, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Woohoo.
Thank you, everybody.
Any abstentions? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.